But here's where I disagree with Kevin. None of this is stimulus. They call it stimulus, again, pick up the Wall Street Journal, watch CNBC, stimulus, stimulus, stimulus. It's not stimulus. It has no stimulative effect. It is deficit spending. It does increase the debt to GDP ratio. It is real money, and it is modern monetary theory. I doubt the typical member of Congress has ever heard of modern monetary theory and can't even articulate it, although articulation is painful because it's so. I know Stephanie Kelton, she's the big brain behind this, and professor at State University of New York. She is the Bernie Sanders whisperer. She was Bernie Sanders' economic advisor in the 2016 campaign. She was his economic advisor in the 2020 campaign. She's not just another ACAD. Nice lady, by the way, big brain, but she's not just another ACAD. She is Bernie Sanders' economic resource. Bernie Sanders is the chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. He's not just nobody. He's the gatekeeper on all fiscal spending when you have a serious case of cognitive decline and senility in the White House, right? So don't underestimate Sanders' role in all this. And she's Bernie Sanders' economic brain. So this is what we're dealing with. Average member of Congress doesn't know anything I just said. They don't know it, but they're doing it. The point is, whether you know it or not, whether you can articulate it or not, whether you read her book or not, I recommend her book. Again, just to see how silly it is, you got to read her book. She says, and this is her from her book, this is not my version of it, that we don't need a bond market to fund deficits. That the existence of the bond market is a favor to investors because it gives you a place to put your money, but we don't actually need one. All you have to do is give wire instructions to the Fed for Lockheed, Boeing, et cetera, and the Fed can wire the money directly to Lockheed to pay for the F-22 Raptor. I mean, she says that. It's like the bond market. Why do you need to issue bonds to pay for things? Just give the Fed the wire instructions and have them send out the money. And we don't need a tax system. And Kevin said, well, maybe we'll raise taxes to pay for that. That's probably right. She said, but no, we don't need a tax system to pay for things. All we have to do, again, just tell the Fed to send the money. And so why do we have a tax system? Well, she would say, well, it's to redistribute wealth, of course. Take it from the rich and give it to people who don't have it. And just in case there's some inflation, you might dial it down with high taxes. I get it. Right, Stephanie. So we have inflation, declining growth. You think raising taxes is your cure? Well, I'll leave that to her, but that's what's going on in Washington. Now, here's why it won't work, because the research, and here I'll look to Ken Rogoff at Harvard and Carmen Reinhart. She was at the University of Maryland, who's at Harvard briefly. She's now chief economist for the World Bank. Carmen on her own with associates and Kevin and Carmen together have done a ton of research on the impact of high deficits on fiscal growth. And what they've shown, developing economy, short time frames, long time frames, 100-year frames, 800-year frames, every time they look at it, they come out with the same result, which is that if there is a Keynesian multiplier, and there probably is, although query whether you're just bringing growth forward rather than actually creating net new growth. But yeah, if you're in a big enough rut, you got to climb out of it. So let's say there's such a thing as a Keynesian multiplier. It's like everything else. I would say if you want to understand economics, go to Los Alamos or ETH in Zurich. You got to talk to physicists if you want to understand economics, because they understand complex dynamic systems and phase transitions. The economists don't know much. But what it shows is that 90% debt to GDP is what the physicists would call phase transition, through the looking glass, again, common language, tipping point, et cetera. I don't like that phrase, but that's what it is. Above that, so it's diminishing marginal returns to the point of 1 and then below 1, meaning at 30% debt to GDP, which is a very comfortable level if you do some more deficit spending. For every dollar spent, you borrow a dollar, spend a dollar, you might get $1.25 of GDP. But then all of a sudden it's like $1.10, then it's like $1.05. But once you go past 90, you borrow a dollar, spend a dollar, and you get like 90 cents of GDP. Well, what are you at 135? Well, you're 135% debt to GDP. You might borrow a dollar, spend a dollar, and get 50 cents of GDP. In other words, you're increasing the debt. You're increasing the debt to GDP ratio. You're decreasing the Keynesian multiplier, which is already below 1. So in other words, negative growth relative to the spending. The one thing you're not getting is growth. And so Kevin's exactly right about the deficit path. And I would say that where we are in the debt to GDP ratio curve, not only is that not stimulus, what you're going to get, because people look at it, they use common sense. They're like, you know what? I always say when it comes to your own money, everyone has a PhD. People look at this, and what they do is they save more. They save more. And eventually they'll get into gold and hard assets, which again, I agree with Kevin on, because it can only end one of several ways. There are only a couple of ways for this to end. One is default. Like, okay, we're just not going to pay you. Okay, Argentina. The U.S. won't do that, doesn't have to do that, because as long as you can print the money in the same currency as your debt, there's no reason to default. You just print the money. And MMT actually says that. So we're not going to default, okay? But there are a couple other ways out. One is inflation. And by the way, Kevin said I'm in the disinflationary camp, which I am, but he used the phrase at one point long term, which I'm not. So right now, yes, count me as a disinflationista, not an inflationista. That's absolutely right. But you look out, this is what we do because, if you have the right models and predictive analytics, you look out to 2023 and beyond, I would expect decades of high inflation. Decades of high inflation. But we're not there yet. We've got to get through the bottom of the chart. So I would say we're still in a disinflationary environment. You guys, all of you have said several times, real rates are going down, which is a good for gold. Actually, real rates are going up. And the reason is nominal rates have gone up, but inflation is going down. So the real rate's going up. Now, and Kevin said something I thought was the most important thing on this call, and I agree completely. He just said, you got to have negative yields to get out of this. And Kevin is exactly right. You need negative yields. But let's talk about negative yields. In 1980, I took my first mortgage buying a condo in New York. Actually, it was a condo in New York. And my mortgage was 13%. And I told my mother, and she cried because her first mortgage was 2%, in the 1950s. And I said, and Mom's like, well, you're paying 13%. I said, Mom, I'm paying 13%, but inflation is 15%. And I was living in New York where the taxes at the time were 50%, 50, and the mortgage interest was tax deductible. So my real after-tax cost of borrowing was -8. Because my 13 was really 6.5. 13 was like 6.5 because I had a 50% tax rate, and then two more for inflation, because inflation was 15 and rates were 13. So my real rate was -8.5.